They buried millions of gallons of salt water under the desert, and what grew back should not have been possible. China's Taklamakan Desert is one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. The name, translated from the Old Uyghur, roughly means, you go in, you don't come out. It stretches across more than 337,000 square miles of northwestern China, making it the world's second largest shifting sand desert. No rivers cross it, no rain touches most of it, for years at a time. And for centuries, it has been eating the land around it, swallowing villages, burying farmland, advancing quietly towards cities that had no way to stop it. So when engineers announced a plan to pump saltwater, actual brine from deep underground aquifers, into channels dug along the desert's edge, and then plant trees beside those channels, scientists were skeptical. Saltwater kills plants. Everyone knows that. You cannot grow a forest with poison water in a place where nothing grows to begin with. But here is what happened instead. The project began in earnest in the early 2000s along a corridor on the desert's southern rim. The engineers were not trying to defeat the desert with fresh water they did not have. They were working with what the land actually held. Deep beneath the Taklamakan sit ancient brackish and saltwater aquifers, reservoirs of water too salty for crops, too salty for drinking, but water nonetheless. The plan was to flood a grid of channels with this water, line both sides with a specific tree, and see if anything held. The tree they chose was Populus euphratica, the desert poplar. It is sometimes called the tree of life in Central Asian traditions, and there is a reason for that name. This species evolved over millions of years in salt-heavy soils along desert river systems. Its roots actively filter salt. It can survive in water with salinity levels that would kill most agricultural crops outright. And it grows fast enough that in certain conditions it can put on several feet of height in a single growing season. Within the first few years after planting, something unexpected began to appear in the soil between the poplars. Other plants were taking hold. Tamarisk shrubs, wild grasses, a scattering of reeds along the wetter edges of the channels. No one planted them. They arrived on their own, carried by wind and by birds that had begun stopping in the new shade. The trees were doing something the engineers had not fully anticipated. Their roots were pulling saltwater up, filtering it through their tissue, releasing moisture back into the air through their leaves. They were, in a small but measurable way, beginning to change the microclimate around themselves. That is the part that takes a moment to absorb. These trees were not just surviving the salt. They were metabolizing it, using it, and in doing so, creating conditions where other life became possible around them. The scientists monitoring the corridor began to record soil salinity levels that were, over a period of years, slowly declining in the areas between the tree rows. The trees were not just holding the sand in place. They were, gradually, changing the chemistry of the ground they stood in. If a story like this gives you hope, comment the word hope so we know you're watching. By the 2010s, the green corridor along the southern edge of the Taklamakan had grown to cover hundreds of miles. Satellite images from that period show a thin but continuous line of vegetation threading along the desert's rim, a border that had not existed before. Sand dunes that had been advancing toward roads and farmland at measurable rates year after year had slowed. In some documented sections, they had stopped entirely. But the scale of what China was attempting was not limited to one corridor. The broader program, known internationally as the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, began in 1978 and was designed to run until 2050. It is sometimes called the Great Green Wall, a name borrowed loosely from Africa's similar ambition, though China's version is older and, in terms of raw scale, still the largest tree planting effort in human history. The goal at its inception was to plant a shelter belt of trees across the northern and northwestern stretches of the country, a living barrier against the desertification that had been advancing for decades, threatening the agricultural heartland. The program has planted, by official records, more than 66 billion trees over its first 4 decades. That number is large enough to be almost meaningless on its own, so consider it this way. The total forested area created or restored under the program covers a region roughly the size of Ireland, planted where there was, in many cases, nothing but shifting sand and bare rock before. And yet the story is not simple. Early phases of the program had failures. Large monocultures of single species, particularly certain fast-growing poplars planted in rows, proved vulnerable to insects and drought. When one species gets sick, and there is nothing else in the system, everything goes at once. Scientists and engineers who reviewed those early losses pushed for a shift toward mixed plantings, toward species that had evolved in those specific regional soil and climate conditions, toward the kind of biodiversity that makes an ecosystem resilient rather than fragile. That shift in strategy is where the results began to change at a level that surprised even the monitoring teams. In the areas where mixed, native species corridors replaced the monoculture rows, wildlife began to return in ways that had not been part of any plan. Foxes and hares moved into the new brush. Birds of prey followed. In documented cases along the Muas Sandy Land, a desert region in Inner Mongolia that had been largely barren for decades, the combination of restored plant cover, reduced grazing pressure, and strategic water management converted more than 93% of the degraded land into stable, vegetated ground by the late 2010s. The Muas is now, in large portions, no longer classified as desert. Farmland that communities had abandoned generations ago is being farmed again. There is a phrase that comes up consistently when researchers describe what happens in these restored zones. They call it a feedback loop, but in the best possible sense. More plants mean more roots holding moisture. More moisture means cooler ground temperature. Cooler ground temperature means less evaporation. Less evaporation means more of the limited rainfall that does arrive actually stays in the soil. And more soil moisture means conditions that favor even more plant growth. At a certain threshold, the system begins to sustain itself. It stops needing constant intervention. It becomes, in the precise scientific meaning of the word, alive. The saltwater channels in the Taklamakan were never going to turn a vast desert into a forest. That was never the goal. The goal was the edge, the boundary between what lives and what doesn't, the thin line where human decisions either hold or fail. And along that line, the trees held. By 2023, monitoring stations in the Taklamakan corridor were recording biodiversity levels, meaning measurable populations of insects, birds, and small mammals that had not been documented in those locations within living memory. The sand dunes nearest the green corridor had not just stopped advancing, in some sections they had retreated. This matters beyond China. Approximately 40% of the Earth's land surface is classified as dry land, and roughly 500 million people live in areas currently threatened by desertification. The methods being refined in the Taklamakan and across the 3 North program are being studied and adapted in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, and in the American Southwest. What was learned from the failures of monoculture, from the success of salt-tolerant native species, from the mathematics of how long it takes a feedback loop to become self-sustaining, those lessons are being written into restoration projects on every continent. The unreal part, the part that keeps coming back when you trace this story to its end, is not the scale of the planting. It is what the land itself did once the conditions were right. The engineers provided the channel and the tree. The salt-filtering root system was already inside the poplar, refined by millions of years of adaptation to exactly this kind of hostile ground. The birds that brought the grass seeds were following instincts older than any human plan. The feedback loop that began to stabilize the soil was not engineered. It was allowed. That distinction matters. The most successful restoration projects in the world share one characteristic. They put the right pieces back in place and then get out of the way. Nature does not need to be built. It needs to be unlocked. In a desert that has been called a place of no return, they drew a line in the sand, and the sand moved back. If you believe nature still has a chance, subscribe. Your support keeps